But before we start, I thought I wonder if we can catch up with you. We can catch up with you on your life journey thus far. I know you write in your book, I quote, "I don't expect my work to end here." Right? And Unapologetic exists at the crossroads of retrospection and vision. And so I thought, in the spirit of past, present, and future, maybe you could share with us a little bit about what pulled you into community organizing and now towards a PhD, and what's next for you. Welcome.
Well, first, thank you so much for having me, for the invitation, and the opportunity to talk with folks during this time in our broader university community. No one has ever framed my writing as retrospective and also about vision, like putting those two things together. And I think that's an apt description. It makes sense to me in so many ways, because that, to me, is also what organizing is, and particularly what organizing towards for the sake of Black liberation is about. It's about being grounded, being in a constant practice of retrospection, thinking about what has happened, because like time for Black people, and the way I think about it, is not a linear process. So we're always, in my mind, I'm always somewhere a couple hundred years ago, and I'm here. And with any, if it's a good day, I am perhaps, in a good way, 100 years from now as well. And that is both retrospective and visionary, I think. That's what it means. It's about being back there, right here, and over there, all at the same time, at a different time. And so catching up with me, I'm trying to catch up with myself, frankly, in this world that we live in. So I'm seeing my students trying to enter the room right now. I'm a TA for Dr. Nicole Spigner, and so I'm seeing their names pop up, and I'm really excited. I'm like, get them in here. But catching up with myself in this particular moment is in many ways feeling caught up and bound up in many of the world events, be it the COVID-19 pandemic, be it the continued judicial and extrajudicial, one could argue, all judicial killing and violence against Black people. I mean, I just read this, learning about the story today of an Asian woman who was followed into her home in New York City and killed. And so surrounded by violence. And also at the same time witnessing, at least in 2020 to date, the largest single day of protests in recent history. And that was in many ways a uniting of, or an alignment of demands surrounding the defunding and or abolition of policing in the US and in other parts of the world as well. And so I spent a good amount of time focused on activism. I started as a student. I got involved in activism and organizing as a college student. And then later began to do more organizing outside of the university in St. Louis and in Washington, D.C., New York City, and different parts of the country, and connecting with people across the world. And throughout all of that work, there's a constant thread of being in when we have the opportunity to be in a space of questioning, to be in a space of curiosity as much as possible. And for me, pursuing a PhD at this time in my life is about continuing in a spirit of curiosity and in a spirit of having questions that I felt that I needed time and space and resources to ask them. And, in society as it is, academia is one of the places where I could get that, I could have that type of space. And I knew that I wanted to situate myself within a Black studies space, and at minimum, an interdisciplinary space. Like I knew I needed to do that because of where I come from. I studied history and international studies, and as an undergraduate, I also have a master's degree in social work from the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis. And so I'm, I spent a long time being an organizer. So the way my mind works is history all the time, storytelling all the time. And then theory is here. How do I think about these things? And then literature is something that I think I'm coming into an intellectual space. It's something that I've always engaged personally. It's also a place where I've come into understanding myself and also understanding history. Literature has been a significant portal for me to understand myself and the world that I live in and the world that we live in. And so I am in a moment right now where I'm thinking about myself as a storyteller. How do I go about gathering the information and the skills and the relationships I find necessary to tell the stories that I need to tell, that I'm yearning to tell about Black people's lives, that are more complete stories in a world where incomplete stories about Black people's lives are reproduced and generated for various means, including profit, but also punishment, all sorts of things. And so that storytelling for me, those skills, the information and the relationships, and I would also add resources, I find that in being a historian, honing my craft as a historian. I also find that in honing my craft as a filmmaker. And I also am finding that in my craft as a writer, and I write fiction as well now. So it's like to me, it all goes back to telling more complete stories about Black people's lives, for the sake of developing more complete solutions and ways to go about our liberation. And that's not, I came to a moment where I was like, organizing is one way to do that. And good organizers are also great storytellers. I think great organizers are great storytellers. And so I came to a point where, my friends tell me I'm always going to be an organizer. They say that's never going to leave you. And I'm like, where else do I need to organize people and ideas? And so again, that for me, it looks like honing my craft as a historian, my work as a filmmaker, and also the novel that I'm working on that, maybe after I finish my second year paper, I'll be able to get back to this novel, but it's going to be a while. So I just have a lot of things in this head of mine. And where I am now is, like, frankly, before I joined this conversation, I was just in our Black women writers class. And all day, my energy level has been all over the place, but it's being in conversation with people, like literally this conversation now is giving me energy that I didn't necessarily have, several hours ago. So that's where I am.
Great. I'm so glad to hear you talk about storytelling, because the chapter in your book that I know you asked us to read another chapter, but the chapter that really, because I'm a historian too, that really drew me was the one on storytelling and telling, as you say, more complete stories. And I wrote down a quote that I'm going to use someplace from you. It says, you say in the book, "I am now clear that my hunger for a more complete story must become a shared strategy for collective liberation." And I just love that so much. I'm going to put it somewhere in a, tape it to my computer.
Thank you.
No, it's just, yeah, so thank you. That was so powerful, and knowing how, we're used at this academic space can create this space of creativity and honing skills, and that's fabulous. So maybe we can switch to the articles that you suggested we look at. I mean, so why these two pieces?
So when I was thinking about, so what am I obsessed with, basically? Like I said, storytelling. And what about stories? What kinds of stories am I interested in telling? So to me, as someone who is committed to a practice of Black feminism, and why we even call this Black feminist ethics and relationality. When I'm talking, I know there's all kinds of ways to think about ethics, but when I'm saying, when I say ethics, I mean, what governs my actions in the world? What are the guiding values? Who do I belong to? Who are my people? What informs literally the way I am with other people and the way I am with myself, and even the land and the other living things around me? What else I'm sharing this world with? So that's when I say ethics. And so for me, Black feminist ethics are about, okay, how is the way that I show up in the world informed by an understanding or an analysis of how the world operates and a theory of how the world could operate or should operate? So how is it what I'm doing, how I am with other people, grounded in this belief and practice of dismantling all forms of oppression and taking action towards and contributing to the transformation of the society in which I live and the society that I won't live in someday, the world that is here after I'm no longer alive. So that's what I mean when I say a Black feminist ethic. And that is in turn informed by threads within the Black radical tradition, you know, as Cedric Robinson would talk about it, and the ways I think other people would talk about the Black radical tradition of this genealogy of efforts in the face of, or in the midst of coloniality, in the midst of the Atlantic slavery, of many other things, of the legacies of both of those systems that still, or processes that still exist to this day, and saying, hey, we want to tend to the entirety of ourselves, the entirety of our being, the entirety of our sets of knowledges, and the entirety of an awareness of the ways that we have struggled together, and even the very contradictions or antagonisms that we have to struggle with as Black people with each other, and for sure the ones with people who aren't Black folks and people who are actively our opposition, or actively engaged in violence against us. So I hope that helps make sense, like what I mean when I say Black feminist ethics. And I think there's a lot more that could be said there. So the second part about relationality lends to the ethics, but very specifically how we are with each other. How we are with each other. And we recently read Glissant's book, Poetics of Relation. And the way that he talks about how we might understand diaspora as a rhizome, as a place that has no single route, as a place that has no even single destination, but the ways that we are connected through networks of culture, of experiences, of literal geographies, waterways, ships, the ship. I think about Tiffany Latabo Kings and her work in talking about the shoal. The ways that we are connected in the ways that we are with each other. How do we relate to each other? Not just those of us who are who can mark ourselves as physical beings right here, the people I'm in class with, but our ancestors. And I'm talking about all the ancestors, not just the ones who have our best interests in mind, or the ones that we think are great to bring up, you know? And so I just wanted to start there with why Black feminist ethics and relationality for me. And so these two pieces, the piece about from June Jordan, a report from the Bahamas, it just hit me in the gut the first time I read it. And I can't remember who sent it to me or how I came across it. But this essay is so much about her encounters with other Black women in the Bahamas, and her observations about gender and class amongst Black people from varying places. To me, it's an essay about diaspora and the things that we have to contend with within diaspora and the differences across diaspora. But she is also talking about this moment where she has a student from South Africa who is in a relationship in which she's being abused. And she has this moment where she's wondering whether this other student who is Irish might be able to help her help the South African student. And the student who is Irish has a sticker on the back of her car, I think, where she says, where the sticker is about Bobby Sands. And it lifts up, it like evokes a Martin Luther King quote, basically. Mm. And for people who don't know about Bobby Sands, he was a revolutionary, an Irish revolutionary, fighting against colonialism in his home. And folks should totally look up Bobby Sands and all the history, all that's, it's a lot outside the scope of this conversation. But this essay has so much to do with how people are with each other across the difference. And Audre Lorde, I wrote the essay about Audre Lorde. It was a commission piece when with the new edition of an edit of a volume of her of Sister Outsider, new edition of Sister Outsider, where Mahogany Brown wrote the intro. And so folks wanted to have some companion pieces. And I said, you know, what do I want to write about? I mean, so much has been written about Audre Lorde, and so much more can be written. Frankly, people should write lots of things about Audre Lorde and her thinking and her doing, her activism and her writing, for sure. And so I wanted to put those two pieces up for your students to think about and to read, to forward some ideas about how we can be with each other, and thinking about a Black feminist ethic that is like grounded in the work of two Black feminists who have, gosh, the imprint they have on my thinking is I can't measure it. And so there's this one line in, well, there's several lines, but there's one part in a report from the Bahamas that I have been thinking about for quite some time, and I want to read it. It's on page 13. I have to read a couple sentences.
Okay.
So she writes that, and when these factors of race and class and gender absolutely collapse, is whenever you try to use them as automatic concepts of connection. They may well serve as indicators of commonly felt conflict, but as elements of connection, they seem about as reliable as the precipitation possibility or probability for the day after the night before the day. It occurs to me that much organizational grief could be avoided if people understood that partnership in misery does not necessarily provide partnership for change. When we get the monsters off our backs, all of us may want to run in very different directions. And so that, since I read that, like that has been on my mind ever since, like thinking about that. What happens in a world without prisons, policing, and punishment as a means to deal with conflict, harm, and violence? What happens when we win that? Because we're gonna win it one day. It's gonna happen. And we might very well run in different directions. And so when I initially read this, I said, oh, you know, my reaction was running in different directions means a break in connection. That's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it, I was talking with Dr. Savannah Shange, and we were just talking about this article, and she was like, well, I thought that meant that people running in different directions means that they're like actually embracing and experiencing like liberation, because they get to go in other places, in other directions. So I think putting those two things together, those two possibilities together about what happens with how we are with each other once we get the monsters off of our backs, is how might we still care about each other? And in our varied pursuits or our varied experiences of liberation, even when we are no longer sharing space, institution, or even perhaps identity, we may identify ourselves differently in the wake of the abolition of systems that do not serve us well. you know, there's an idea that, you know, there may come a time where, like, what Black liberation looks like is that the category of Blackness no longer exists. Some people like think that way, and thinking about how Blackness as a category came to be in our modern era. And I don't know where I land on that exactly, but what I am more confident about is that liberation looks like liberation requires transformation, for sure, of the world that we live in and also of ourselves. And thinking about Grace Lee Boggs and how Grace Lee Boggs talks about the importance of transforming oneself, of revolution in oneself, in order for revolution in the world to happen as well, or for them to happen concurrently. Is that on the other side of that transformation, if brought by revolution, and I have different ideas about revolution for sure, is that I should think of myself differently. And I don't know what the implications are for identity and or identification. I think those two things can be different. And I don't even think of abolition as just like in the wake of, like, what's the wake of abolition? I think abolition is a forever process. Just like I think transformation is and liberation are forever. I think the terrain in which we have to negotiate and struggle with and towards, or just within, should change. Now, I don't think we reach this destination where all things are all good. And I'll also say this because this is a question asked earlier this morning. There's a lecture that Dr. Jarvis Gibbons gave on fugitive pedagogies this morning. And someone asked a question about the end of the world and like how he might think about that. I'm gonna take the liberty to say what I think about that, since we're in conversation talking about transformation. Is as a historian, and as a sci-fi lover, I love sci-fi. I love reading it. I love watching it. All kinds of things. I love it, love it, love it. It's even at the end of the world, material still exists. Unless this thing is blown up, material still exists. I imagine that being or that person walking into a store front, or walking into something that was a library, or opening up the device or hearing a radio transmission. Even with the physical world and perhaps much of the metaphysical world that we inhabit and experience being gone, things will likely still remain. So to me, I need a lot more than just the end of the world. I need a lot more than that to be where I'm going or where we're going, or to think that that is enough to end anti-Blackness or any other form of system of oppression. I want a lot more than that, because I don't think that the end of the world is enough, because the same things might happen again if the science fiction writers are right, which some of them happen to be right quite often. So those are my thoughts on that.
I'm trying to wrap my head around the end of the world. I think I might settle for something a little more transformed. Like, maybe something that, a sense of something that I would really like to work towards, that I really desire. I can't quite fathom the sense of just, I don't know, I can't. So I wanted to bring us back to some of the articles themselves, because we read the articles in my theorizing feminisms class, and the students wrote some questions, and I wanted to ask you just maybe to comment on some of the questions that they posed, and then we can open out to people who are joining us tonight. And if you have a question, just please put it in the chat, and we will And we also have the opportunity for people to unmute and speak. So what we'll do is read the question, and if the question, if the person who poses the question would like to add more to it, they can just unmute and speak. Okay. So one of the questions I think actually falls in very closely to the article, and is also a question I asked about the ethics of going to resorts like these, right? Described by June Jordan. And on the one hand, June finds she's insured by her safety as a Black woman who is in need of rest, right? But she's constantly plagued by her consciousness of race, class, and gender in the way that identities don't explain, right? The common out and that, what do you do when you have several axes of identity, but that under certain circumstances are at odds and are contradictory?
Well, this is a tough question for me to answer, and I'm thinking about how to enter the question or to begin to address it. In one way, is I think that how we talk about identity is oftentimes absent of an analysis of power. And that for me, it is simply not about how I and even as a Black, even saying as a Black person, that's not something that I just decided on my own. It is related to various, it is related to, what's the word? I don't want to just say history, but there's a whole history behind that. There's a whole set of power dynamics behind me arriving to this place, or me existing as and even saying I'm a Black person or being identified as a Black person. And so I have to think about power and how all of that is operating, from June Jordan, a Black woman who is a professor and who is a poet and is, by US standards, not actually a wealthy person. I guess maybe, I don't even know if she would have been considered middle class in the US. Maybe someone else knows more about that than I do. But in relation to the people at the resort, she has more economic wealth. She has more money. I'm gonna say she got more money than them. She makes more money than them. And so the reason why I think it's important to think about to always consider power in these questions about what does it mean for this Black woman to go to this resort where these Black people make less money than she does, is to think about how do we get to a point where that's the reality? How do we get to a point where one works, what creates the conditions where one works determines not just how much money they make, but what their class status is and what is associated with their particular job. And so I could just say, we shouldn't go to resorts. I could say that. And then the question to me then comes up is okay, what about Olive? What do we what considerations come into play around Olive and then the man who has to stand, he stands in the water serving people drinks at the beach. What is our analysis around how and why the Bahamas, or our understanding of how and why the Bahamas has to rely on tourism for their economy? Or do they? Why do they? And so to me, it's a point of curiosity, because I could say one thing, but I also don't have the power to determine whether or not there's a resort in the Bahamas. So I could say one thing in this conversation and say it should all go. What am I going to do about it? What am I going to do about it? How is this reflected in the way that I live my life? And, that's tough. I think it's tough. I don't have a neat answer for that. I don't have a fun revolutionary activist answer about how we should orient ourselves with resorts. I do think that we shouldn't be naive. And I think there's a little bit of surprise that June Jordan is expressing in this essay. That I'm why are you surprised? Why is this the first time you thinking about class? You don't have to go to the Bahamas to see class differences between Black people. You live in New York, who's cleaning the bathrooms at your school? Who's taking care of children in your, who's nannying children? So that would be a question that I have. Like, I don't need to go to the Bahamas to find out about the class differences between Black people. So that was a part in the essay. I was like, I wouldn't go as far to say that this is her first time realizing it by any means. But the essay, to me, at points it reads as though some of this is a surprise, and it shouldn't be.
I thought it was kind of interesting that they're both the kind of the colonial dimension to this, that they're both Olive and June are products of colonialism, right?
Yes.
But within that structure, they're the relative power of the societies they live in then creates this kind of class divide between them. And so in my class, we kind of tossed around, like, how could the two women be connected in the same way that the last story, the two women over domestic violence, is just really thinking about maybe it needed, like, for one woman's need for rest and the other woman's need to be sustained, to have a job. Like, maybe it's a different kind of tourism that we have to think about, maybe a different kind of cooperation, a cooperative tourism. I don't know.
That's right. I definitely think that there are different ways to go about it. And I wish I could cite some people who have thought about this, but I imagine that there are people who have actually thought about this and have good ideas for how to do it. But one thing is for sure, under capitalism, under a capitalist economy, like global capitalism, we might be able to have a cooperatively owned resort that people can go to. But even that one cooperatively owned resort is in a sea of capitalist economies, local, national, global economies. And so a part of it for sure is about dismantling capitalism. And it's not just capitalism. I mean, when I think about capitalism, it is always already about, it's always already racial, it's always already gendered, always, like, it's redundant. Racial capitalism, many people say, is just redundant. So I mentioned power, but I can't end the response without saying capitalism, and obviously as it is connected to settler colonial projects and colonial projects, we can't have that and then deal with the issue of class difference, and not just difference, but like the literal, I don't want to say inequalities, but to me that feels like a lighter way to describe what's happening here. But the situation at hand, you're not doing anything that is sustainable if we're not also doing something about capitalism.
Well, I wonder if we could switch gears a little bit and talk about, I have another question from a student about the Audre Lorde essay. And she writes, in your essay, Audre Lorde taught us to honor our differences. You discuss the importance of tackling terror, specifically terror surrounding queer, transgender, gender nonconforming, non-binary, and intersex identities and people. What does this look like? How can folks begin dismantling this terror to form coalitions?
One of my biggest frustrations in the academy is how people talk about coalitions. I don't know what people mean when they say coalition. I feel like we're speaking two different languages. Like, what I understand to be a coalition includes organizations and perhaps sometimes individuals who are working who have some set of shared values and a shared purpose, who are working towards a particular change. Like that's what I understand coalitions to be. I've heard the word coalition being used so many different ways in the academy. So I'll just say that's what I mean when I say coalition. I don't know what the student in particular means with coalition. So I'm not entering coalition with anyone who you don't enter a coalition unless you know what's up. Like what this is about. A coalition is formed on the basis of having some shared interest. Like period. So if I'm in coalition with you, and that doesn't mean that we have all shared the same shared interests or all the same shared values. It means that there is something that we have agreed to. A coalition is not in and of itself the force of like societal transformation. Sometimes people come together for coalition with a singular purpose of saying, okay, here in Chicago, we're in Evanston, but in Chicago, a couple miles up the street, there was a coalition to oust Cook County State's Attorney Anita Alvarez. And within that coalition, it included people who are abolitionists, who believe in the abolition of policing, prisons, and carceral punishment as means to deal with conflict, harm, and violence, and for it to be transformed with systems, processes, and ways that we are with each other that are generative, that are restorative, and actually like grounded in justice. That is not punitive. And so, and then there included people who were like, lock them up. That's, throw them in, whatever. Or people who were saying, well, let's just tinker around this and make up some reforms, some changes here and there. But we had a singular, like a very clear purpose, even though people had different motivations. And so the terrors surrounding, and Audre Lorde in that essay is talking about, in parts of the essay is talking about Black people, like us, in our communities and how we are with each other. And the terrors that some Black women have about being associated with lesbians. And I extended the conversation to talk about the terrors that some people have specifically about Black trans women and whether or not they are associated with Black trans women and the terror surrounding that. And so I extended that to talk about other groups of people. And it's like, we can be in a coalition about closing a jail. We could be in a coalition about voting rights for Black people. And people can still bring in terrorists about other, people who are also a part of, who are also Black folks living geographically, but not relationally in community, or even relationally in community, because the word community is thrown around a lot. And so in coalition, depending on the duration of it, depending on the nature of it, the commitments, and who shows up, who should be there, what issues are being focused on. If I am talking about Black folks coming together for the sake of Black liberation, I should already assume that the very terrors that circulate in our society that people hold about themselves and about each other they're going to show up. And so to be in coalition with each other, I think it comes with an assumption that we're going to have to deal with some shit, and that we need a set of values that are reflective of the way that we want to be with each other while we are in coalition with one another. And that might mean that some people have to stretch. No, it means that everybody has to stretch, even those who think that they have embodied these values. Because sometimes folks who think that they are the most radical and they have embraced the most, and they also hold the most marginalized identities, they think this, at least, they are going to show up in the most generative way. That's not necessarily true. Your identity does not, then your politics are not automatically ordered based on your identity. Politics are choice. They're active. It's not just based on what I think, it's about what I do and how I am and what I have chosen to actually do and to take up. So just to wrap that up, because I can't talk about one thing without giving like greater context. So I can be a little long-winded sometimes. But I think it's really important to break down some of these words and these concepts that are used very often, and to be really clear about what we mean when we say them. And that just because we are going back to June Jordan, just because we share misery doesn't mean that we're going to also be partners in change. Because I have the same identity as you, because I've even had a similar pain or experience as you, does not mean that we are equipped to work well with each other. So we should go into coalition, not in a defensive mode, but in an offensive mode to say, hey, y'all, we got to think about this stuff. And in the process of getting this work done, or before certain aspects of the work gets done, or we advance so that we can come out on the other side of this, even if we run in different directions after we have won or we have lost, that the values and the meaning and perhaps like the vision for the what is possible doesn't all fall apart.
Yeah, so I think that I think what's amazing is what you bringing these two pieces together, right? The sense of like, how do we deal with our fears, right? In the piece on Audre Lorde, and then, fear and terror, right? And I think that your separation of the two was very thought-provoking for me. And then this question of how do you, if our identities are not kind of natural spaces where we are similar, right? Or we have shared goals, how do we have to really work at that sense of what frightens us about each other,
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Maybe what we could do is turn to some of the questions that that we didn't prepare in advance, and take some questions from the floor. So maybe Elliot, you could take a look at the chat and people, and I see also hands raised.
Yeah, so there's one question in the chat right now, just basically wondering if you can offer some insights on the importance of embracing and navigating disagreement as a Black feminist praxis.
Oh, Mecca, that is a tough one, because like disagreement is inevitable. Politics is about engaging in, like confronting various, we were just talking about this earlier today, antagonisms, like things are gonna come. They're gonna bump up against each other, whether we like it or not. And in navigating and embracing disagreement as a Black feminist praxis, two parts of that is like, how do we think about disagreement? What are our various orientations of disagreement? Like knowing that for myself, and even like being curious enough to to ask those questions in the formation, be it of a coalition, a partnership, a department, I don't know, a project, a program. How might we think about what disagreement is and how it shows up in our lives already? Because I'm a part of a generative somatics community, and I talk about this quite often. And really, so much of it has to do with and it's a Black generative somatics community. And we do work for the sake of Black liberation. And so much of it is about how we show up in our bodies in the work, and particularly how that is informed by trauma, and how it's informed by violence and things in the world that we've experienced and the world that we live in. And so I might yell at you, Emeka, and you might want to, go like this towards me. I might yell at another person. I might yell at you, Elliot, and you may want to move back. And that's just like one example of how people, like some of us have tendencies, the way that we're going to deal with disagreement. So a part of that, if you're taking up a Black feminist praxis, is having the space, the time and opportunity to even find out what that is, like to even know what that is. And unfortunately, we live in a society where many people either don't have the opportunity to, or are actively discouraged from being in their bodies or have been hurt in their bodies. And so when conflict comes up, we might react in all kinds of ways that may or may not serve the things that we say we believe in. And so it's a practice. It literally is a practice of developing a practice of figuring out what one is going to do and what we are going to do and be aware of when we disagree with each other. And a part of that, and I know disembodiment is like the cool girl in both feminist and much Black studies theory, to get rid of the body. And I get why, because so much of the scholarship of the medical industry, of various carceral systems have bruised and battered and abused the body, and have also taken up bioessentialist ways that in turn like help to generate and justify violence. And if we don't take the time to understand how that has impacted our very bodies today and how we show up with each other, then to me, it can prevent us from engaging in a Black feminist praxis. And so to me, it's automatic. Like if I want to live in a world where people have access to whatever healthcare they need, all the healthcare they need to both be affirmed in their body and their mind and their spirit. I want that. And so I'm willing to work for it and organize for it. So if you want to live in a world where people can be in their bodies, then where do you start being in your body? How do you start to be in your body? I think that requires support. And it's not just something we just wake up with knowing how to do. And so that's a part of the reason why I'm in the somatics community that I'm in, to learn how to do that in light of like my own traumas that I've experienced and the various traumas within my communities, and the traumas that have existed in the genealogy of my people. So I hope that helps to answer your question, Emeka. I can get like.
I'm going to call on Paulina.
Hi, Charlene. The second chapter of my dissertation is actually on Jordan and Lorde together. I'm arguing that they elaborate a Black queer feminist poetics of diaspora. So I just wanted to say I'm so excited to see you talking about the two of them together, and also that I got an excited face from you. That's great. My question is about June Jordan. I've read this essay before, and I really appreciated you pointing out that she seems to be surprised by some of the class dynamics that she encounters in the Bahamas. And I was wondering if we think across the longer arc of her work, if you feel like this ethics of relationality, of thinking about class differences, especially across the Black diaspora, does that continue in some of her writings about other international zones, or does that continue in some of her writings about the US? And I'm thinking maybe in particular the essay Nobody Mean More Than You about Willie Jordan and the politics of language in the classroom. So I'd be interested to hear if you think this politics of relationality sort of is a through line for Jordan throughout her literature.
Oh, I haven't read enough of her literature to know, to be completely honest with you. I am I won't say I'm a newer student of her work, but I feel like I don't have enough knowledge to say whether or not it's a through line. We recently read her poem about my rights in class, and I remember once I got to the very last, I don't know, 6 or 8 lines, but the part that starts with "I am not wrong, wrong is not my name," and the rest of that piece. And what I can say, like based on that poem and her as a meditation, I think of not a single diaspora along the lines of racialization, perhaps, but the ways that people are connected across geographies in dealing with imperial violence, dealing with violence that on the level of when she's talking about sexual violence, that when she's talking about sexual violence in the poem, I think that she is discussing a way that people who have experienced, not only people who have experienced these forms of violence, but the way that people have enacted forms of violence are related. Like there's a network of violence, a global network of violence at play here. And that we shouldn't just be looking at the relations between like those of us who understand ourselves, or people who understand themselves as being under the heel of imperialism or settler colonial projects or patriarchy, ableism, transphobia, homophobia. We shouldn't just think of the relations between those folk, but we should be thinking about the relationships between the people we understand or we think. Because I don't think there's a neat line, frankly. One could argue there's not a neat line all the way, of those who have the power to operate and benefit from the enactment of violence through those very systems. So I think when I think about that poem, if I could say that about her work, like that part of her work, I think that poem in particular suggests something about connection, something about relationality, in many ways. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to call Nick.
Hi. First, thank you so much for being able to talk with us about your work and also broader questions of liberation and politics. I have a question in terms of kind of a coalitional politics, but also kind of your forwarding of an ethic of relationality. So like what that kind of stood out to me in terms of like my work and like kind of, you know, exploring different ideas within intersectionality and also kind of Blackness studies is kind of to work by the Combahee River Collective in terms of kind of understanding Black liberation. So quote is like, if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression. Mm-hmm. So I guess to you, in what ways can an ethic of relationality or alliance commitments or coalitional politics and kind of your last kind of explanation of experiences of trauma motivate the types of scholarship produced within the university and the way it can be mobilized within kind of material and pragmatic ways outside of the academy to address the kind of centrality of the Combahee like River Collective in terms of destroying the systems of oppression and ultimately leading to forms of Black liberation. So I guess like in short, what does like work within the academy mean to you and the larger struggle for Black liberation?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So that part of the Combahee River Collective statement is lifted up quite often. I lift it up quite often as well. And in conversation with Barbara Smith about this, one thing that she emphasizes is that that particular part of the statement and the whole statement is one of like if we want to think about the temporality of the question, it is about in these systems of oppression being dismantled that then lead to Black women being able to be free. That everybody else, that's being free, that's all happening at the same time. It's not Black women first and then everybody else. It's not that we dismantle capitalism over here and then that means that we gonna get free and then the rest of y'all. But it is necessarily a collective project of as many people as possible who are trying to throw down. That part is my part. Barbara Smith will not say that like that, I don't think, but she hasn't said that like that to me. But it is necessarily a project that requires collaboration. I know America does a lot of work on collaboration. It is necessarily a collaborative project. It don't mean that everybody's gonna be down, but we're gonna need a lot of people for that to happen. And so in the academy, to me, it means that people don't shy away from not just interdisciplinary work, but reading across fields, that we read across fields, that we read people and we engage in conversation with people who are out, not only outside of our department, but even outside of like just how we think, our methods. The archives, if we consult archives, or not being afraid, I'm saying as a historian, not being afraid of archival work, it's how are we going about our, like, if you're gonna pull together a panel or a workshop or a conference, who is there? Who are you in conversation with? And it's like, how are we modeling a way of being with each other in the academy, in our work, in our scholarship, that reflects at least what I've been thinking about and what I've learned from Black feminists who've been doing this much longer than me, that we don't have to wait to start to try to do those things. We can do that now. And it's not just about, oh, well, let me read all Black women this year, or let me just read Black feminist texts this year. But how are our reading practices and our teaching practices? What's on your syllabus? You know, what are you assigning your students? Things like that. How is it showing that my thinking is in conversation with, like, people outside of my field, outside of my department, outside of, you know, schools like Northwestern or other like, I don't know what the word is, other institutions that are like comparable or whatever. But like, when's the last time you've had a conversation with somebody who is not in the academy about a thing that you are thinking about? And not in an extractive sense. I'm not talking about a research subject. I'm talking about a person who's also thinking about these things. So that's the short of it. I know we're at 6 o'clock.
Well, thank you so much, Charlene. This is really amazing. I think more than one of the things I most admire about your speaking and your writing is actually how precise you are.
Oh.
How the way you define feminism, the way you define abolition in your book, and the way you define Black feminist ethics and relationality in this evening with us was, you know, I'm going to listen to this recording because I really feel like you nailed it.
Oh, thank you. I probably need to listen to it too, because some of this stuff, you know, I'm in process of thinking about, and I've started to write about it, and it informs my scholarship. But sometimes I just need to talk it out before I write it, and so I do genuinely appreciate the opportunity to think out loud with you all, because, you know, I. Like the students, particularly as a fellow student, I'm still learning so much, and I appreciate the opportunity. It's a privilege to be able to think out loud and have people listen to what I have to say. So thank you.
Thank you, and I hope everyone will join me in unmuting and